By June of 1985, the soil across Harlan County had turned to powder. Not the kind of dryness you work around, the kind that gets into machinery seals, cracks irrigation furrows, and starts showing up in the faces of people who've been watching the sky for weeks and stopped believing it would change. The National Weather Service had been issuing drought advisories since April. By May, they stopped calling it a dry spell. The Kansas City forecast desk was using the word exceptional. That word meant something specific in agricultural terms. It meant subsoil moisture was gone. It meant whatever you planted had no reserve to draw from. It meant the margin between a reduced harvest and no harvest was shrinking to almost nothing, and it was shrinking fast. This wasn't the first dry summer the county had seen, but 1985 was hitting on top of two other things that made it different. Commodity prices had been falling for 3 years. Corn was under $3 a bushel. Soybeans weren't much better. And interest rates, even after starting to ease, were still high enough that most operating loans were costing farmers 8 to 12%. The drought didn't create the crisis on the county's farms. It exposed one that was already there. The pivots stopped first. Center pivot irrigation had expanded fast across the county through the late 70s and early 80s. The economics were straightforward. One operator could irrigate a quarter section or more with minimal labor. Set the speed, set the application rate, walk away. Compared to gated pipe, flood systems, or hand-moved aluminum lines, pivots were efficient in every measurable way. Less water wasted, less time. Lower per acre cost at scale. Banks financed them. Extension offices recommended them. Neighbors bought them because neighbors bought them. The problem with efficiency at scale is what happens when the system it depends on fails. Pivots run on electricity. Specifically, they run on three-phase electricity. Industrial-grade power that draws significant load from the rural distribution grid. A single large pivot system can pull 30 to 60 kilowatts. Run 20 of them across a county simultaneously in the middle of a heat event, and you're stressing infrastructure that was built for average load, not crisis load. By mid-June, the county co-op had posted a notice. Rolling power restrictions were going into effect. The regional utility was managing load across a multi-county area. Irrigation systems were being asked to operate on staggered schedules. Some were being cut off entirely during peak demand windows. Mid-afternoon, when the heat was worst and the demand on the grid was highest. For pivot operators, this was a logistical problem that had no clean solution. You could shift your irrigation window to nights and early mornings, but crop water demand peaks during the day. Nighttime application helps, but it doesn't replace daytime stress reduction. And if the utility cuts your power during an approved window without warning, which happened twice in the first week of restrictions, your pivot stopped mid-rotation and sat there. Half the field watered, the rest waiting. Crop stress doesn't wait. Dale Mercer had 480 acres under cultivation east of town. Corn on the north fields, soybeans on the south. He had 2 electric pivots, both financed in '81, both still carrying debt. The pivots had worked well. He'd reduced his labor hours significantly, and his yields had been competitive. In a normal year, the system made sense. He also had, sitting behind the machine shed under a tarp and a layer of dust and a couple of years of neglect, a 1963 International Harvester diesel-powered irrigation pump. His father had bought it. Dale had kept it because getting rid of it never rose high enough on the priority list, and because some part of him, not a romantic part, more like a practical instinct, said that a piece of equipment that ran independently of anything external had some value he couldn't fully account for yet. In the third week of June, with the power restrictions tightening and one of his pivots stuck midfield for the second time in 5 days, Dale started thinking seriously about the old engine. He didn't pull the tarp off immediately. He stood there doing math in his head. Rough math. The kind you do when you're not sure you want to know the precise answer. The diesel engine, if it ran, could power a pump that could feed hand-moved aluminum irrigation pipe across a portion of his acreage. Not all of it. Maybe 60, 70 acres on a good day, cycling through. It was labor-intensive. It was fuel-dependent. It was, by every modern agricultural standard, a step backward. But backward was relative when forward wasn't moving. The tarp came off on June 22nd. Underneath was a six-cylinder diesel engine mounted to a centrifugal pump on a steel skid frame. The fuel tank had corroded along one seam. There was a crack in one of the coolant hoses. The belts looked dry. Dale checked the oil. It was dark but present. He checked the fuel lines. He primed the system manually, which took longer than it should have because the lines had some air in them. He turned the crank. Nothing on the first attempt. The engine had sat long enough that compression seating was sluggish. He worked through the decompression lever, rotated the flywheel by hand to seat the rings, tried again. On the third attempt, the engine caught, briefly, and died. This is the part that doesn't get talked about enough when people discuss backup systems. Having redundant equipment is not the same as having redundant capacity. Equipment that sits unused for extended periods degrades in ways that don't always show until you need it. Gaskets dry out, fuel degrades, electrical connections corrode, belts harden and crack. The backup you thought you had may require significant repair before it functions, and that repair takes time you may not have. Dale spent the better part of 2 days on the engine. He replaced the coolant hose. He pulled the injectors, cleaned them, and seated them again. He sourced a fuel filter from the co-op in town. They still stocked older equipment parts, barely. He bled the fuel lines again properly. On the afternoon of June 24th, the engine started and held. It ran rough. There was a miss in one cylinder that he couldn't fully address without pulling the head, which he didn't have time for. The engine ran at about 80% of rated capacity, which meant the pump output was lower than designed. He estimated he was moving about 60% of the water he'd need at peak application. Not ideal, not nothing either. The aluminum irrigation pipe was stacked along the fence line, sections of it bent from years of moving, some couplers seized. He straightened what he could, replaced the worst couplers, and laid out 2 lateral runs off the main line. The first watering cycle took most of a day. He moved pipe by hand, 30-foot sections, each one carried, connected, adjusted. His son helped when he wasn't in school. His wife ran fuel out in the afternoon when the engine drank down the tank faster than expected. Diesel cost was the next variable that needed tracking. In 1985, diesel was running around 80 cents to $1 per gallon, depending on where you bought it and how much. The engine, running at load, was burning roughly 4 to 5 gallons per hour. 8 to 10 hours of operation per day put you at $35 to $50 daily in fuel cost. Across a 90-day critical irrigation season, that was potentially $4,000 in diesel alone. More if you ran longer hours. That number had to be measured against something, the value of the crop. Corn in 1985 at roughly $2, 75 to $3. There's 0 joule per bushel, with a reduced stress yield of maybe 80 to 100 bushels per acre on the acreage he was covering, was worth somewhere between $220 and $300 per acre. 60 irrigated acres represented $13,000 to $18,000 in potential crop value. $4,000 in diesel to protect that was mathematically a sound trade. If the engine kept running, if the water actually reached the plants in time, if the yield held above break-even, there were a lot of ifs. He ran the engine anyway. The drought kept spreading. By early July, the county extension office was reporting topsoil moisture at less than 10% of field capacity across most of the county. The visual signs were appearing in fields that had no irrigation at all. Leaves rolling on corn plants, the characteristic curl that indicates the plant is conserving moisture by reducing its surface area. Fields that were 3 weeks from tasseling and already showing stress were unlikely to recover full yield potential even if rain came. The critical window for corn is narrow. Stress during pollination translates directly to reduced kernel set, and reduced kernel set is something you cannot fix after the fact. On the south side of the county road, Dale's neighbor had a 3-pivot system covering most of his operation. Modern equipment, well-maintained, financed recently. When the rolling restrictions started, he'd shifted his schedule and managed. When one of his pivots threw a gearbox on July 3rd, a mechanical failure unrelated to the drought, but compounded by the heat stress on the equipment, the repair timeline extended past what his dealer could accommodate. Parts were back-ordered. Every irrigation dealer in the region was in the same position. Every farmer was calling at the same time. That field went 3 weeks without full irrigation coverage during the critical growth stage. You could see it by mid-July. The difference in canopy color was visible from the road. Dale's field, not thriving, not exceptional, was a consistent, flat green. His neighbor's field had sections that had gone from dark green to a lighter, almost yellow-green, the color of a plant that's shifting resources away from growth and toward survival. The corn wouldn't die, but it wouldn't yield what it should have either. That's the economic calculation that rarely gets stated plainly. A partial loss is not half a loss. Crop insurance deductibles, input cost, recovery thresholds, loan covenants. These create cliff edges in farm economics. A field that yields 60 bushels per acre when you needed 100 to break even is not a partial success. It may be a net loss after inputs. The math of agriculture under leverage doesn't reward almost. The engine overheated twice in July. Both times Dale caught it before it seized. The temperature gauge he'd rigged up with wire, and a clip was crude but functional. He shut down, let it cool, checked the coolant level, ran it again. The miss in the third cylinder got worse in the heat. He adjusted the timing manually, which helped some. He was running the engine harder than it was designed to run continuously, and he knew it. He also knew that stopping was the only alternative that made less sense. His fuel supply became an issue in the second week of July. The co-op's diesel allocation was being rationed. Farmers with larger operations and existing fuel contracts had priority. Dale was buying in smaller quantities, which meant paying slightly above the posted price, which meant his cost per hour calculation was climbing. He started tracking usage more carefully, cycling the engine off during the hottest mid-afternoon hours when evaporation loss made irrigation less effective anyway. He was optimizing a system that was already operating below design capacity. It worked mostly. The labor demand was real. Moving pipe twice a day, once in the early morning to shift sets, once in the evening, took 2 to 3 hours each cycle. That was 4 to 6 hours of physical work on top of everything else a farm requires in summer. His back was bothering him by the third week. He stopped talking about it because there was nothing to say. The pipe needed moving. At the co-op, the conversation had shifted. A few of the farmers who'd upgraded to fully electric systems were openly frustrated with the grid restrictions. One of them asked Dale how the old diesel rig was holding up, in a tone that suggested the question was partly genuine and partly a way of not admitting he wished he had one. Dale told him it ran rough, but it ran. That was the truthful answer. By August, the county had taken measurable crop losses. The Extension Office estimated that unirrigated corn acreage in the county would average somewhere between 40 and 65% of normal yield. Fields with interrupted or partial irrigation were projected to come in at 60 to 75%. Fields with consistent irrigation, fewer than most farmers wanted to count, were tracking closer to 80 to 90% of normal. Dale's north field, the corn acres he'd been hand irrigating with the diesel pump, was going to yield somewhere in the 85 to 95 bushel per acre range. That was below his 5-year average, but above his break-even threshold after factoring in input costs and the diesel expense. The electric pivot fields were performing similarly where power had been consistent, and falling short where it hadn't. He was not going to have a good year. He was going to have a survivable year. At that point, those were different categories. The farms that lost entire irrigation coverage for 2 weeks or more during tasseling were looking at 40 to 50% yield reductions on those acres. On a leveraged operation, that was the kind of loss that forced conversations with lenders. Some of those conversations were already happening. The farm crisis of the mid-'80s was not abstract. It was specific, and it was accumulating across the county in individual balance sheets that couldn't absorb another bad season. The difference between Dale's situation and his neighbor's wasn't competence. His neighbor was a capable farmer. The difference was a single variable: whether the irrigation system had a dependency point that could be disrupted by something outside the farmer's control. Efficiency works until the system it depends on fails. The harvest came in September. Dale moved his corn in 2 weeks, working the fields in order. The yields confirmed what he'd estimated. Not good, not catastrophic. He paid off the diesel fuel costs, settled the operating account, and sat down with his wife to go through the numbers. They were tight, They had been tight for 2 years. They were tight in a way that had a floor under it, which was different from the neighbors who were dealing with numbers that had no floor. The diesel engine went back under its tarp. Dale replaced the cracked coolant hose with a new one before covering it. He drained the fuel tank to reduce sediment accumulation. He noted the cylinder miss and wrote down what he thought the cause was, so he'd remember when he pulled it out again. He did not feel triumphant about any of this. He felt tired in the specific way that comes from doing something difficult for a long time with uncertain outcome. He also started making a list of what the engine would need to be ready faster next time. The fuel lines, the injectors, the belts. He figured he could knock 2 days off the startup time with some preventive attention. 2 days mattered when the soil was already cracking and the power restrictions were already posted. That's the real lesson from 1985 in Harlan County. Not that old technology beats new technology. The electric pivots were better systems in almost every measurable way. They used water more efficiently. They required less labor. They covered more ground. They were the right investment for the conditions they were designed for. The drought wasn't a condition anyone designed for. Or rather, most people designed for normal conditions and assumed abnormal ones wouldn't persist long enough to matter. That assumption was wrong in 1985, and it's been wrong in drought since. The grid restrictions that summer were a preview of what infrastructure looks like under sustained stress. The farms that had no fallback had no options. The farms that had fallback options that actually worked, not hypothetically but mechanically, operationally, demonstrably, had something to work with. Redundancy looks wasteful in good years. It looks like the only thing that mattered in bad ones. The pivot systems were not the failure. The assumption of uninterrupted grid access was the failure. The assumption that efficiency eliminates the need for a backup is the failure that shows up in every infrastructure-dependent industry when the infrastructure fails. Dale wasn't smarter than his neighbors. He just hadn't gotten around to removing a piece of equipment that didn't fit the modern operation cleanly. And when the modern system stalled, he had something to turn the crank on. The drought kept spreading, the pivots stopped, the engine kept running. Water meant leverage, not in the financial sense, but in the operational sense. It meant the crop had a chance. It meant the losses were bounded. It meant that when September came and the combines rolled, there was something to harvest. Not enough, but enough. If stories about preparation, operational risk, and what actually holds when systems fail matter to you, subscribe. Because sometimes survival isn't about having the newest system, it's about having one that still runs.